Welcome, everyone,
toda a gente seja bem-vinda
to another educational
a mais uma
of Rebel,
formação do Rebel,
a set of seminars
o conjunto
that
de
we've
seminários
prepared for the
que
summer, since
preparamos
we couldn't have the
para o
Youth
verão, em virtude de não
Revolutionary
podermos ter tido o
Summer Camp,
ajuntamento de
Fourth
jovens revolucionários
International.
deste ano, da Quarta Internacional. Um, e
In
para
this
este
debate, we
debate
have
temos
Sophia
a
Rosa,
Sofia Rosa,
militant of
militante do
PSOL,
PSOL,
Brazil, from the
do
health
setor
sector,
da
and we
saúde,
have
e
Mamadou
temos
Ba,
Mamadou
militant
Ba,
of Topeira
militante
Vermelha,
da Toupeira
and
Vermelha
part
e
of the
dirigente
direction of
do
SOS
SOS
Racism
Racismo.
from Portugal.
O
This
debate
educational
especificamente
is called
tem o
Black
nome de
Lives Matter
Vidas Negras Importam, Black Lives Matter,
Structural Racism
Racismo Estrutural
and White Privilege.
e Privilégio Branco. Obviamente vamos querer falar sobre.
This is a
É uma
theoretical
formação teórica,
educational,
mas
but
vamos
we'll
querer
also
também
want to
falar
talk
sobre
about
a
the
situação
situation of the movement
do movimento
and
e
of
do que
what's
se está
been
a
going
passar
on
ultimamente
lately at a global
a nível
level.
global.
And with no
E,
further delay, I
Sem
would
mais
pass the
demora,
word to
passaria
Sophia.
a palavra à
Sophia, whenever
Sofia.
you want.
Sofia, quando quiseres.
Hi, everyone.
Olá a todos e todos.
First of all, it's a pleasure to be able to
Primeiro, é
be
um
here,
prazer poder
to be
estar
able
aqui nesse
to
espaço,
think
podendo
alongside with
pensar, né, junto com
comrades of
camaradas
our tradition.
de nossa tradição um
Some of the
pouco
challenges that
os
are
desafios
being
que são
put in
colocados
front
para a luta
of us for the
antirracista
anti-racist
dentro do
struggle
nosso
within
contexto, né?
our context.
Importante
It's important to
resgatarmos
rescue an
aí um
historical
processo
process of how we
histórico,
got
né, e
here,
como chegamos até aqui,
so we can also
para
some
também
way
conseguirmos de alguma
consolidate
forma
and to point
consolidar, né, e
directions
apontar as
about
direções
which
sobre
struggles and
quais
which
lutas e
struggle
quais
strategies we
estratégias
have
de
in front of
luta
us,
teremos aí à frente para
so we can actually go
conseguir de
forward
fato
with the
avançar na luta
anti-racist struggle at the
antirracista
global
a
level.
nível mundial.
I would like
Gostaria de
also
começar
to start by
agradecendo,
thanking
né,
the
a
opportunity to be
oportunidade de
sharing this
estar
space,
compartilhando esse espaço, né,
thanking the invitation
agradecendo
of
a
the
convite, né,
organization and
da
Topeira
organização
Vermelha,
Toupeira
and
Vermelha
also the
e
satisfaction to be
também a satisfação
beside
de estar ao lado do
reference
companheiro de
comrades of
gerência,
the
né,
anti-racist
da luta
struggle of
antirracista
our
de
tradition,
nossa
Mamadou
tradição,
Ba.
Mamadou Bar,
I think we have a good
e
opportunity
termos
to build
uma boa
debates and
oportunidade de
reflections from here.
construir debates e reflexões aí.
I salute as well every
Saúdo também a
anti-racist and
todos e
black
todas as
comrades,
camaradas antirracistas, né,
also
negros,
from our
negras,
tradition.
também de
I
nossa
believe that
tradição.
if we are here today,
Acredito
being
que se
able to
estamos
do this
aqui hoje
debate
podendo
and
fazer esse
having the opportunity to
debate,
deepen these
tendo a oportunidade de
formulations,
aprofundar essas
it's
formulações,
more than fundamental to
acho que
rescue the
fundamental
history and
resgatarmos aí a
contribution
história
of
e a
those that came
contribuição dos que
before
vieram
us.
antes, né? Então, também faço esse ressalvo. Bem,
Before I start
antes de
the
começar
systemization
em si,
itself
né, a
of my
sistematização um pouco
speech
da
and
fala,
the
né, das
contributions we
contribuições que
have been
veio
thinking
pensando
for
aqui
our
para o nosso
education of today,
debate de formação hoje,
it's
é
important to
importante
start at a
conseguirmos
common ground
sair do mesmo
in a
patamar de
collective way.
forma
So
coletiva,
I
né?
would like to
E
have
aí
a
eu queria
certain
fazer, de uma certa
audacity and
ousadia, um
invite every
convite
single person that
para
are
que
here
todas e todos
today
que estão aqui assistindo, né, essa nossa
to
formação,
imagine with me.
imaginem
I'll
junto
invite you
comigo.
to
Vou
imagine.
convidá-los a imaginar.
I'd like that we could
Gostaria que a gente
imagine
pudesse
a
imaginar
person, but not
uma
any
pessoa,
person.
mas não qualquer pessoa.
A
Uma
person that is
pessoa
the
que seja
personification
a personificação
that has
de um
fully
sujeito que
access
acessa
to social
plenamente os
rights.
direitos sociais.
Let's think
Vamos
a
pensar, né, e
personification of a
personificar
subject that
um
has
sujeito
access to a
que
health
acessa
system
o
of
serviço de
undeniable
saúde com
quality, that
qualidade
has access to the
inquestionável,
best
tem acesso às
education
melhores
institutions,
instituições de
and that
ensino
is able,
e
without
que
any
consegue
problem, to
sem
move around the
problema
city
nenhum
without
circular
fear.
pela cidade, sem medo.
Let's think in that
Vamos
person
pensar
that
também
represents a
nessa
standard
pessoa
of
que
beauty
representa um padrão
socially
de beleza
put or constructed.
socialmente
That
colocado.
person that is not
Essa
afraid to be
pessoa
arrested
que não tem medo
or to be
de ser
mistaken by
preso
someone
ou de
of
ser
bad temper,
confundido com
for
alguém de má
example.
índole, por exemplo.
Let's try to
Vamos
imagine a
tentar
person that has
imaginar
the access
uma
to a
pessoa que
truly
tem
good food
acesso a uma
and
comida
healthy,
verdadeiramente boa, saudável,
without agrotoxics
sem
or other
agrotóxicos ou sem
chemical
outros
addictives. Let's think
aditivos
as well in a
químicos.
person that
Vamos
is able
pensar
to
também numa
show
pessoa que
its
consegue
love in the public
manifestar o seu
space
amor em praça pública,
without
sem
any
medo
fear of
de
violence or
nenhum tipo
violation.
de violência ou violação.
Let's think about someone that is free,
Vamos pensar numa
that
pessoa que
can
você
manage
convive
to have its voice heard,
precisa
to have
ter
its
sua
history
voz
taken
escutada,
into
ter
account,
sua história
have its
considerada,
voice
ter sua
valued.
voz
Let's think in that
valorizada.
subject
Vamos
that is
pensar
able to
naquele sujeito
hegemonically
que
write the
consegue
history of the world.
hegemonicamente escrever a história do mundo.
Well, bringing this to the
Bem,
context of
trazendo um
Brazil,
pouco para o
the
contexto do
characteristics
Brasil,
that person
as
would present
características que
would
essa pessoa
probably be of
apresenta
someone that doesn't
provavelmente
even
seria
live in
de uma
Brazil.
pessoa que talvez nem more no Brasil.
But at the global
É,
level, I believe this
mas a nível
process
global, eu
has
acredito que
many
esse
variations,
processo tenha
but we
muitas
would mainly
variações, mas que
get
majoritariamente vamos chegar
a
à
characteristic of
característica de
a
um homem
cis,
cis,
white, and
branco,
rich man.
rico.
And it's that
E
subject,
é esse
cis,
sujeito,
white, and
homem,
rich man,
cis,
in
branco,
which
rico,
in which it
que
was
é o
built
sujeito em que
historically
historicamente se
a
construiu e
universal
se constituiu
subject,
como um sujeito
a
universal.
subject
O
that was the
sujeito
reflection of the
reflexo para
struggles,
a construção
social
das
rights and
lutas de direitos
political,
sociais, né? E de tensões
historical
políticas,
and economic
históricas e
tensions that
econômicas que
are
estão
put
colocadas
in this process as a
nesse
whole.
processo como um todo.
Probably they will make part
Provavelmente
of
eles
that
fariam parte
1% that
daqueles
we have been
1%, né?
fighting
Que a gente
and
tanto
thinking about in our
combate e
tradition.
vem formulando em nossa
So
tradição.
I invite
Então,
us not to
convido a gente
forget or
a
lose
não
sight
esquecer e não perder de
who
vista
represents this
quem
subject
representa
and
esse sujeito
which
e que
interests they
interesses
represent.
eles representam.
And within this context,
E aí, um pouco
we
nesse
start to
contexto,
enter to the
a
discussion
gente
about
começa a entrar
race,
no tema da raça, né?
a
A raça
concept,
que é
a
um
notion
conceito, né? Uma
that
noção
historically
que
goes through
atravessa historicamente
many variations. The
diversas
use of race, of
variações,
the
né? O
term
uso da
race, it's
raça,
not
do termo
static.
raça, ele não
It's
é estático, ele é
historicized.
historicizado.
It has an
Ele tem um
economical
lugar
and political
econômico,
place to be
político, né,
disputed.
para ser
The
disputado.
history of race,
A
of the
história da
usage that
raça, do
before
uso, né, que
was
antes
used to make
era utilizado
classifications
para fazer
essentially between
classificações
plants
inicialmente
and
entre
animals,
plantas
and
e
later
animais,
adopted
e que mais
by
tarde foi
classification between
adotado
human
para uma
beings.
classificação entre seres humanos,
That usage is
ele
also the
é
history of a
também a
political and
história de
economic
construção
constitution
política e
of what we
econômica
understand
que
to
a
be a
gente tem
modern
como
society,
sociedades modernas,
influenced by
né,
capitalism
pautadas pelo
in all
capitalismo
its phases.
em todas as suas
Today
facetas,
neoliberal,
hoje
uh,
neoliberal, né,
in
e
more generally
globalizada de uma
global.
forma mais
It
geral,
starts from a
e que
process
parte
of primitive
historicamente de um processo
accumulation of
da
capitalism.
acumulação primitiva do
So the process
capitalismo,
of
né? Então,
slavery
o
was
processo de
fundamental
escravização foi
to understand the
fundamental
relations
para
of race
entender
and
as
racism
relações
that
de
are
raça e de
affirmed
racismo que são
today in our daily
proferidas
lives
hoje no
at a
nosso
world
dia a
level.
dia a
This
nível
same
mundial,
logic
né?
that
E essa
served
mesma lógica que
in that
serviu
first moment as
naquele
a
primeiro momento,
justification
né, como uma
on the possibility to
justificação,
create
né, sobre
these
a
categories
possibilidade
from
de
the human
criar essas
differences
categorias a partir das
that
diferenças
we nowadays
humanas, né,
understand
o que a gente
as
entende
race
hoje como raça, né,
has constituted the logic of
constituiu
the
também
human
uma
being
lógica de ser humano
who needs
que precisa ter
a
uma base, né,
biological
uma
apparatus
dimensão
or dimension
biológica
as a
enquanto
living
um ser
being,
vivo,
also as labor,
também
so there's
enquanto
an economical
trabalho, né, então
dimension,
tem uma dimensão
dimension,
econômica colocada,
psychological, that human
psicológica,
being
né?
that
Então, esse
thinks
ser
and
humano que
speaks.
pensa e que fala.
And from the
E a
positivism
partir do
of the
positivismo
19th
do século
century, it was
XIX,
started to be
começou a se
created this human
estruturar esse tipo
investigation
de
that were being
interações em que as
consolidated
diferenças humanas, né, se
scientifically with a
tornaram, foram se
racist
consolidando
logic
cientificamente por uma lógica
of the
racista, né,
biological
da
theory,
teoria da biológica,
creating these notions of
criando essas
inequality
noções de
and differentiation
desigualdade e de diferenciação
of what
que o
Fanon will
Fanon
help
vai
us to
ajudar a
identify
gente
as
a
humans
identificar
and
enquanto
non-humans.
humanos e não humanos, né?
Fanon
Fanon foi
was a very important
autor
author,
importante,
despite the
né? Apesar
differences
de diferenças
theoretical and
teóricas,
methodological with our
metodológicas
tradition.
com
I
a nossa
believe it can
tradição,
contribute a
acredito que
lot
ele
to
pode
make us think
contribuir
about these
muito com a gente
notions
para pensar um pouco
where
essas noções onde
our
a
construction
nossa,
as
a
global
nossa
left
construção enquanto esquerda
hasn't been able
global
to
não
reach in terms
conseguiu
of
atingir,
formulation.
né, em termos de formulação.
So I invite us
E
to
aí eu
make
convido um
usage
pouco a gente a
of some
fazer esse uso,
contributions it
né,
brings
de
us to
algumas
think about
contribuições que ele traz para a gente para
how
pensar
the logic of
como
racism
se opera
operates
a lógica do
itself in our
racismo,
society.
né, na nossa sociedade.
Fanon
Fanon, ele
organizes graphically
organiza
from a
graficamente,
dimension
né,
of
a partir de uma
a
dimensão
superior
entre um
place
locus
where the
superior,
humans are,
onde estão os humanos,
where
onde estão
those who
aqueles que
present
apresentam
hierarchical relations
relações
within
de
labor
hierarquia no
are
trabalho,
where
onde
it's
se
made the
faz o
process of the
processo de
patriarchy
patriarcado,
and
né, de
sexual
divisão
division
sexual,
And he organizes graphically
Vamos
the
definir sobre
inferior dimension,
graficamente o patamar
where the
superior, onde estão os
non-human
indivíduos
individuals
não
are the
humanos, né,
animals,
os
where
animais,
it's produced
onde
the
se faz o processo de
undifferentiated
exploração
exploitation process of
indiferenciada do
labor,
trabalho
and by
e que, por
consequence,
consequência disso,
promotes and operates an
promove e
exclusion
opera
of
uma
power
exclusão do
of agents
poder,
of
da
history
agência da
without the
história,
permission for the
né, sem a
production of
permissão da
knowledge
produção de
and
saber
construction of
ou de
science.
construção de
And that
ciência.
line that
E essa
divides the
linha
superior
que divide o
dimension
patamar
of
superior
those
dos
humans,
humanos, né, dos que
of
são
those considered
considerados
as
enquanto
agents of
agentes da
history,
história e
builders of that
construtores desse
process,
processo,
in
em
relation with
relação
those from the
aos do
inferior
patamar
dimension,
inferior,
that line which
essa linha
separates
que
both
separa
blocks
esses
is
dois
where
blocos
racism
é
is
onde é
operating.
operado o racismo.
So, look,
Então, vejam bem,
to discuss the question of
discutir a
racism
questão do
is also
racismo
fundamental to even
é
understand
fundamental
our
também para
relations
entender,
with
inclusive, a
nature
nossa relação
from the
com a
contribution
natureza,
that
a partir
Fanon
dessa
brings.
contribuição que
If we
Fanon traz.
manage to identify
Porque se a
that
gente
nature
consegue identificar que
is
a
within
natureza
the
está
category
dentro
of
da
the
categoria do
non-human,
não
together
humano,
with
né,
animals,
junto aos animais, né, aos outros
except
animais
the other
também,
animals
exceto o
except the
ser
human
humano,
being,
a gente
we
consegue
can understand
perceber
the
a
logic of
lógica de
exploitation, the
exploração,
logic of
a lógica de
inferiorization put, for
inferiorização
example, in our
colocada,
relation
por
with
exemplo, na
nature,
nossa relação com a natureza,
dismissing
né,
the place
instituindo
of nature
o lugar da
itself
natureza, né, enquanto
as a space and
um
environment
espaço, um
where
ambiente
relations
onde se produz as
between
relações
human beings,
entre
animals,
seres
and other
humanos e
types of
animais,
life
né, e outros tipos de vida, e outros tipos
and
de,
existence
de
are produced
existência,
with
com
that
essa relação
transformative and
transformadora e
comified relation with
mercantilizadora da
nature,
natureza
bringing
e
that
trazendo essa
notion of
visão de
human
recursos
resources,
humanos, de
biological resources,
recursos
natural
biológicos, de
resources, that
recursos
logical
naturais,
that
né, dessa
comes from
lógica
that
que
perspective of
vem a partir
construction
da
of
perspectiva de construção
capitalism.
do capitalismo.
And from
E
this
a partir disso, né, a partir
more
desse
general framework
marco mais geral
of
sobre o processo
constitution of
de
racism,
constituição
it's
do
important
racismo,
to
é
claim
importante a gente
the
reivindicar um
conception
pouco
of what we
a
today
concepção
conceive
do que a
as
gente
modern
entende hoje
racism.
como racismo moderno.
Racism is a
O
phenomenon
racismo é um
that
fenômeno
is
que não
not
é
given from
dado, né, a
capitalism.
partir do
It's a
capitalismo,
process that has
se,
shown
se
itself
mostrou
in other
de formas
forms, in other
outras, né, de
faces,
outras
in
facetas,
historical
em
processes
processos
previous to the
históricos
constitution of
anteriores
capitalism.
à
But
constituição do
that, as I
capitalismo,
said before,
mas que a
from
partir do
the
processo, como eu
process
disse
of
antes, de
primitive
acumulação
accumulation of
primitiva do
capitalism,
capitalismo,
it
ele
takes
toma
another
uma outra
dimension
dimensão, né,
with
com
other
outras
characteristics that produce what
características
we
que
understood
produzem
as
o que a gente
racism
entende
today.
como racismo hoje.
And
E
initially are
inicialmente
reinforced
são
by that
reforçadas pela lógica de
pseudo-scientism of the
pseudocientismo,
biological
né, das
theories
teorias
and
biológicas,
that are
que
used
são
within the
utilizadas, né,
framework of
dentro dos
capitalism
marcos do capitalismo
from
a
an
partir de um apoio
ideological
ideológico de
support of
opressão,
oppression.
né? E aí a gente
And
vai ver isso, inclusive,
we'll see that
mesmo pós
even
os
after the
períodos de
periods
abolição da escravidão
of
em
abolition
diversos países.
abolition of slavery in many countries. So from here we
E a partir
understand the
disso, a
logic
gente
of the modern
entende essa
racism,
lógica do racismo
and
moderno
we can also
e
draw a
também
line
consegue
of
traçar
evolution,
uma linha de
not
evolução, né? E aí não
evolution in
evolução
Darwinist
aos moldes de
terms, but a
darwinismo,
process
mas um
of
processo de
accumulation, of
acúmulo de
reflection
reflexão
about what kind
sobre
of
que
racism is
racismo é
this we're
esse que a gente
talking
está
about.
falando, né?
One of the authors
Inicialmente,
I've
os
been reading a
autores
lot
que eu
here in
tenho
Brazil
lido
is
bastante aqui
Silvio
no
de
Brasil é
Almeida,
o Silvio de Almeida,
that even gained
inclusive ganhou
more
alguma
international
expressão mais
expression
internacional
recently,
recentemente.
and he
E
brings
ele
some
traz um
contributions
pouco
so we can
algumas
understand this
contribuições para a
process.
gente entender esse
He
processo.
starts with
Ele começa
what
iniciando,
before
né,
was
trazendo a
understood
dimensão do
as
que antes se
production and
entendia
practice
como
of
produção
racism
e prática
at
do
the
racismo
individual
no
level.
âmbito individual.
So the
Então,
practice of
a
racism
prática do racismo se
was given directly in
daria,
in a
né,
relation of
diretamente uma relação de
subjectivity. It would be a
subjetividade, né? Então,
practice
seria uma
of
prática de desvio
pathological,
patológico,
ethical,
ético,
individual or
individual ou
collective
coletivo de um
deviation
determinado
of a
grupo.
determined of a
Então,
certain
racismo
group.
seria
So racism would be
considerado como algo
considered as
ruim,
something
né?
bad,
Algo
ugly,
feio,
wrong,
algo errado,
and the
e
one
que
who
quem
practiced
praticasse
that ideology
as suas
and
ideologias, enfim,
perspective
suas
should
perspectivas
be
deveriam
punished,
ser
repressed.
punidas, né? Reprimidas.
That's understood
E isso é
as
percebido na dimensão
racism in a
do
broader
racismo
way
de forma mais
when we
ampla,
think
né?
about the process
Essa
of
processo
inferiorization
de
of the
inferiorização,
individuals that
quando a gente
suffer
fala dos
from
indivíduos que
racism.
sofrem com
That
racismo,
has
né?
an
Isso
important
tem uma
dimension,
dimensão
which is the
importante,
process
que
of
é a do processo de
subjectivation of
subjetivação dos
individuals, which
indivíduos,
should not be
que não deve ser
disconsidered.
desconsiderada.
But
Mas
Silvio can
o
help
Silvio
us to
ajuda
go
a gente a ir um
even a
pouco
bit
mais
further.
além.
So
Né?
racism
Então,
is,
o
yes, a
racismo é sim
practice that
uma prática que
focuses
incide
on
na
subjectivity,
subjetividade,
in the
né? Na
subjectivation
subjetivação dos
of
indivíduos.
individuals, but it
Mas
doesn't
não
stop
para
there.
por aí,
We
né? Você
cannot
pode
see
tratar
racism
o
just
racismo
from the
como
individual
individual, uma
perspective or from
perspectiva
the neoliberal perspective,
neoliberal, em
in
que
which
as
relations are
relações se
given
dão
individually.
individualmente, né? Não
They're
são,
not
não
part
fazem
of a
parte de um
political
projeto
project.
político.
And he
E
helped us
aí
to
me ajuda
understand
a gente a
more
entender um
from the
pouco, a
new
partir
from the
da
notion
noção
of
do racismo
institutional racism.
institucional, né?
So
Fazendo,
making
né,
that transition,
essa
because
transição,
there's
porque
a
existe
very
uma
direct
intervenção
intervention
muito direta do
from the
Estado nesse
state in that
processo.
process,
E aí as
and
instituições
institutions
servem
are
para a
there for
reprodução
the
dessa
reproduction
lógica de
and
manutenção do
maintenance
Estado,
of that
do
logic
status
of the
quo,
status quo.
do jeito que está.
However,
Contudo,
this would be the
ela
result
resultaria de uma
of
lógica
what
de
would be a hegemonic
hegemonização do
conduction of
Estado.
the state.
Então,
So,
quem
who
tem
has the
poder
power to
para impor
impose the
as
norms, to
normas, né, para
impose the
impor as
rules,
regras, é que
is the
coloca,
one that
é que
produces the
produz o
process
processo de
of
classificação,
classification and
inferiorização de
inferiorization
determinados
of
sujeitos.
the
E a
certain
gente também
subjects.
consegue
And we
perceber
can also
isso quando
understand
olha, por
that when we
exemplo, o
look, for
processo de
example, to the
encarceramento em
process of
massa,
mass
né? Então, tem um
incarceration,
arcabouço
so
e um
we have a
aparato, né?
skeleton
O
and an
institucional,
apparatus that is
né, que
institutional,
passa
that
por dentro
goes
do
through the
Estado,
state,
dos mecanismos do Estado,
the
para
to
operar a lógica
operate the
racista,
racist logic
né,
to some
para
individuals that
determinados
here in
indivíduos.
Brazil
Que aqui no
have
Brasil tem uma
this has
característica marcadamente
a
negra,
characteristic that is
né,
strongly
mas não
black, but
só,
not
né, se a
only.
gente for olhar para o
If we
processo
look at the
histórico,
historical
os
process,
indígenas
indigenous
também
people
passaram por um
have also gone
processo
through a
de
process of
construção de normas,
construction of norms with
a exclusão,
exclusionary
a marginalização,
marginalization
ao
and
extermínio,
extermination and
né, por
formal
práticas
practices
formais do
of the
próprio
state
Estado.
itself. So
E aí,
Silvio
nesse
will
mundo,
also
é
help
válido
us
a
to
gente
go
ir
further
além
that
dessa
notion
lógica do
of
racismo
institutional
institucional, que
racism,
também é uma
which is
dimensão
also what I
presente
mentioned
hoje
today
no processo
present in the
de
process of
politização e
organization
de
and
dinâmica
dynamic
do
of
racismo.
racism, which
E
will
vai
be
estudar
given
a partir da
within
relação entre o racismo e a
interaction
economia,
between
né?
racism
O que
and
vai
economy.
trazer para a
That
gente o
will bring us
conceito
the
de
concept
racismo
of structural
estrutural.
racism. So yes,
Então,
racism
sim,
as
o
an individual
racismo
I
tem uma
mentioned
dimensão
in the
individual,
individual
das práticas
practices of the
individuais do processo de
subjectivation process.
civilização.
It also has a
Tem
dimension
também uma
operated by the
dimensão
state,
operada
by the
pelo
bourgeois
Estado,
state,
pelo
that
Estado
has
burguês, né?
by
Que
itself
tem
from the
por si
space of
só, a
maintenance
partir do espaço
of the
da
state, the
manutenção do
dispute
Estado,
of that
a
process
disputa desse processo
of hegemony,
de
but
hegemonia,
it will
mas
also be
também vai
directly
estar
related
relacionado
with the structural
diretamente
logic
com uma
of
lógica
how the
estrutural de
capitalist
como se fundamenta
society
e organiza
structures and
a
fundaments
sociedade
itself,
capitalista,
and how
né? E como
capitalism
o
focuses
capitalismo incide
on those
nessas
relations
relações
of
de diferenciação
differentiation
e
and
se
takes
aproveita
advantage of those
das
differences
diferenças,
to
né,
highlight
para
inequalities,
marcar
to highlight the
desigualdades,
production
para marcar
of
a
surplus
produção de
and the
mais-valia
process of
e marcar
exploitation.
o processo de exploração.
So I
E aí,
invite us
e
to
aí eu convido a
reflect
gente a refletir um pouco que,
from
a partir
that
dessa
from this
concepção de
perspective
racismo
of structural
estrutural,
racism, it is
é
important to
importante a
consider
gente
that today
considerar
it's
que
not
não
possible
existe a possibilidade hoje,
concretely
né,
to think a
concretamente,
revolutionary
de pensar
process
um processo
without the
revolucionário
articulation of the
sem
questions of
articular as
gender,
questões de
race, and
gênero,
class.
de raça e de classe,
And it's
né?
from
E
this
é a partir um
framework
pouco
that will
dessas
bring the
marcas
dimensions
que a gente
of
vai trazer um pouco as dimensões
racism.
aí
And
do
I'll now make that in
racismo e
relation
eu vou
to
fazer
the
um pouco
reality
mais
of
essa
Brazil.
relação com a realidade do Brasil.
Well, Brazil
Bem,
is
o
a
Brasil
country
é um
that had
país
its
teve sua
social and economic
formação
formation
social e
made from the
econômica
slavocrat
forjada, né, a partir
uh,
da,
system
do
itself
sistema
and the
escravocrata
process
e
of
do processo de
colonization,
colonização
and as a framework
e que tem como
initially
marco, né, inicialmente
of
aí
a
a conformação
of a confirmation
do,
of
de um
a slavist
sistema
system
escravista, né,
of kidnapping
de
of
raptura, né,
African people
de africanos
to
para
assume the
assumir
process of labor,
o
well,
processo
not labor, of
de trabalho não, né,
exploitation
de
itself in this country.
exploração em si no país.
And behold,
E que
they're
vejam bem,
brought to
são
Brazil
trazidos para o Brasil
within the
não numa categoria
category
de
of
humanos,
non-humans,
mais ainda como
but still as a
mercadoria,
commodity.
né? E aí
Not
esse
as
conceito de
non-humans, but still as a
mercadoria,
commodity.
né,
So that
humana, né,
concept of
de
community,
não
human
humana no
commodity,
caso,
or non-human in
ele
this
foi
case,
fundamental
was
para
fundamental,
se
so he was
conseguir
able to conceive the
conceber
reality
a
of black people
realidade
in
das
Brazil
pessoas
today,
negras no
and how
Brasil,
that
né? E
influenced
como se
the Latin
influenciou
America,
a América Latina,
well,
né?
those processes in
Todos
which
esses
Brazil
processos em que o
brought some
Brasil, de
way
alguma forma,
a
trouxe
protagonism of some
certo
sort within
protagonismo
the
dentro do
anti-racist movement,
movimento
within our
antirracista, né?
geographical
Dentro dos
framework
nossos marcos
and
geográficos
constitution
da
as
Constituição
Latin
dentro da
America.
América Latina.
and that was fundamental for the
foi fundamental
construction
para a
of inequalities,
construção de
social and racial,
desigualdades, né,
in Brazil
sociais e
today.
raciais no país
So we
todo.
look
Quando a gente
uh,
olha é,
at questions
as
like
questões como
access to
acesso à
income,
renda, né, e
process
a
of
processo de
occupation of formal
ocupação
and
do
informal
trabalho
labor,
formal e informal,
we see that
vemos
generally
que
black people
majoritariamente as
have the
pessoas
most
negras
precarious
ocupam os
positions
postos mais
or
precarizados, né, mais
are
precários,
within
ou estão
the
dentro
spectrum of the
do
most
escopo de
unemployed
maior
population in
população
the country.
desempregada no
So
país,
we'll have a
né?
discussion
Então
that will
a
be
gente vai ter uma discussão
important
aí,
in the
acho
debate.
que o debate vai ser importante, que
That
vai
would be
ser
that
esse
place of the
lugar
working
da
class
classe
and its
trabalhadora
crossing
e
of
o
its
seu atravessamento com os
constituents
constituintes enquanto
as
sujeitos, né?
subjects.
Então,
So basically, which are
quais
the
são as
characteristics
características da
of
classe
the working
trabalhadora
class
hoje
today in Brazil
no
and the
Brasil e no
world?
mundo,
This would
né?
be
Acho que vai ser
a
um
good
debate
debate
bom
to have after
para se fazer logo
in
depois
the
no
broader
momento
moment in
mais
which we'll
amplo
be
que a
able
gente
to
possa
share.
ir trocando.
Another question
Uma
that is
outra questão que é
fundamental, and I come from
fundamental,
the
e aí eu
health
venho da
domain,
saúde, né?
which
É
is
pensar o
the access
acesso à
to health,
saúde,
which comes
e ele vem
exactly in the same
exatamente nos
framework
mesmos marcos,
of
né,
that
dessa
non-humanization. So
non-humanização.
today, despite
Então,
the
hoje,
advances made here
apesar
in
dos
Brazil
avanços, né, de termos instituído aqui
with
no
the
Brasil
universal health
um
system
sistema
like the
universal de
NHS, that
saúde,
system
esse sistema
is
universal de saúde
precarious
é precarizado,
as a
né,
chronic
num
process
processo de
of underinvestment
subfinanciamento
and
crônico que
focus on a mass
incide
scale,
numa má
mostly on the
assistência,
black
sobretudo para a
population.
população negra.
And that will
E aí
be an
essa vai ser
important
uma peça
aspect
importante para
to
a gente
analyze
relacionar com o
today in
momento que
a
a gente está
moment of
hoje de
pandemic
pandemia,
where
né?
COVID
Onde a
presents
Covid
itself
se
as
apresenta
a
como
case
um caso, né?
that brings many
Que traz
challenges to
muitos
think about the
desafios
future
para se
and the
pensar
left
o futuro e as
organizations from now
organizações da
on,
esquerda, da
and that is
então,
a
e que
framework
tem um marco
of profoundly
profundamente
crossed by the logic of
atravessado pela lógica
necropolitics,
da
where,
necropolítica,
yes,
né?
the space of
Onde,
the
sim,
states
o espaço do Estado
produces policies
produz
from the
políticas,
necro
né,
power,
a partir do
from
necropoder,
the
a partir da
determination of an
determinação,
exceptional state
né, de um
that is
estado de
actually a
exceção que
state
na
of rule,
verdade é vias de regra,
and that
né? E
place of
aí
rule
esse
of the
lugar de
exceptional
regra do
state
estado de exceção
produces from a normative
produz a partir
base
de uma
and
base
formal,
normativa,
from the
formal,
framework of
dos
law,
marcos do
of
direito,
the
né, de
production of death
produção de
of certain
morte
social
de
groups.
grupos
And
sociais,
here,
né? E
Akili
aí
Membe will
aquele
help us a
meme vai
lot
ajudar
to
muito
do
a
that
gente a
analysis
fazer
of
essa análise de
necropolitics,
necropolítica, né?
understanding that the actual
Percebendo que as
austerity
políticas hoje
policies,
de
the shortage
austeridade,
of
o
social
encurtamento
protection
das redes,
networks,
né, de proteção
it
social,
drowns
elas
itself
mergulham
in themselves
toda a
in a logic
sociedade
of
numa lógica de
helplessness,
fato de desesperança
desperation,
e
and we're not talking
desamparo, né?
about
E
that
aí a gente não está
universal
falando
subject. We're
daquele
talking
sujeito
about all
universal,
the other
a gente está falando de
subjects
todos
that
os outros
present different
sujeitos que
characteristics
apresentam
from that universal
características
subject we
diferentes
talked
do
about
que
a bit
aquele sujeito
earlier.
universal que a gente conversou um pouco mais à frente trazem, né?
And
E
while
aí, ao passo
the justification of
em que
death
a
is given
justificação da morte,
today,
né,
for
ela se
example,
dá
while
hoje, por exemplo,
thinking the
ao
context
pensar o
of
contexto
the
da
COVID
pandemia de
pandemic,
Covid,
in a
numa,
counter position
numa
between the
contraposição
economy
entre a
and the risks of
economia
the
e
economy
os riscos para a
and
economia
the
e a
safety and
segurança
health
e
of the
saúde da
population.
população.
Here in Brazil, to give some
Aqui no
data,
Brasil, para trazer
when we
alguns
think,
dados muito pontuais,
for
quando a gente
example, in the
pensa,
access of the
por
black
exemplo, no
population to the
acesso da população
conditions
negra
to join
às
by the physical
condições para
distancing,
aderir ao distanciamento físico,
which is
né,
a
que é uma
measure that
medida
internationally as
que
taking
internacionalmente tem
a
tomado
protagonism as a
protagonismo aí
major
como um
measure to fight the
carro-chefe para
pandemic,
o enfrentamento à
which is the
pandemia,
guarantee of
né, que é a
isolation
garantia
and
do
distancing,
isolamento, do
we have
distanciamento.
as an
A gente
answer
tem
in the
como
local
resposta nas
institution
periferias do Rio de
Rio de
Janeiro
Janeiro
o
the
caso
common
do menino
case of the
menino
child
João
João
Pedro,
Pedro,
de 14
14
anos,
years old. He was
que
alone
estava
at home
sozinho
in
em
this
casa,
process of
né, nesse processo
isolation
de
and was
distanciamento,
shot by
e que
police
foi
officers
alvejado por
inside his house,
policiais dentro de sua
being shot with
casa,
a bullet
né,
in his
sendo atirado
stomach,
com uma bala na barriga,
and in which his family
e
didn't even have the
que sua
opportunity
família não
or
teve
access
a
to
oportunidade
find
nem
his body
acesso de
alive.
encontrar o seu corpo com vida.
This
Né? O
child was
menino foi
kidnapped by
raptado
the
pelos
police officers,
policiais,
taken away
levado
by
de
helicopter
helicóptero
to
para
another space of the city,
outro espaço
and
da
only
cidade,
after were
e só
parents
depois
able
os
to
pais
find
puderam
his body.
encontrar seu corpo no IML.
When we think,
Quando a
for
gente pensa, por
example, the
exemplo,
case of João
o
Pedro,
caso do
we
João
will be
Pedro,
able to
a gente também
identify
vai conseguir identificar
many other
essas outras
dimensions of that
dimensões
operation of
dessa operação da
necropolitics. Firstly, by
necropolítica,
the
né? Primeiro,
impossibility
por
of the access to health.
impossibilidade do
A
acesso à
child
saúde, que foi colocada pelo
that
menino, né?
was
Que
in
estava em
thesis
tese
abiding to the
cumprindo
sanitary
as normas
rules and that
sanitárias
at
e
his
que
home
em
was
sua
shot by the
casa
police
foi alvejada pela
expressly by
polícia,
a
marcadamente
necropolitic operation
operação
in which the
necropolítica, né?
state
Em que
presents
o Estado se
itself
apresenta
in the
na
production of
produção de
violence to
violência,
that
né?
population,
Para essa população,
especially for being black
especificamente por ser
and
negro
poor.
e ser
I
pobre,
think it's
né?
important
Acho que é
to line
importante
that off.
demarcar isso.
One other question, which
Uma
will
outra
be
questão
important
que
to
vai
us,
vir como
will
fundamental para a gente é
be to
pensar a
think the
lógica do
logic of
desemprego,
unemployment
né? E do
and the
acesso
access
ao
to
emprego
employment, formal and
formal e
informal.
informal.
And that's
E
where
aí
it
me
comes
vem
to me the
também o
case of
caso
the
do menino
child Miguel,
Miguel, de
5 years
5
old,
anos,
that fell off
que
the
caiu do
lift
elevador, né, do
from the
nono
ninth
andar do
floor because
elevador,
the boss of his
porque a
mother,
patroa de sua
that
mãe
was polishing her
estava
nails,
fazendo
not
unhas,
respecting
né,
the
usando
sanitary
as
rules
normas
and social
sanitárias e
distancing, with a
distanciamento,
nail
e uma
worker inside her
manicure dentro da
house,
sua casa
didn't have the patience to
não teve
stand
paciência para
that the
guardar
child
o
that
menino,
was
né, que
asking
estava
for his
doente de sua
mother
mãe, pedindo
would
que sua
have
mãe
attention from his
tivesse o
mother.
retorno
So
dela.
he put him in
Então
the
ela
lift
botou ele
alone,
dentro do elevador
and
sozinho,
that breaks
tinha
some
isso
rules here in
incutido, né,
Brazil
algumas
about
regras colocadas
children
aqui no
being
Brasil
able to
sobre
move alone in
crianças andarem
lifts.
sozinhas em
And the
elevadores,
child
e o menino
unfortunately passed away
infelizmente veio a óbito, né, porque
since the
teve uma
lift
queda
fell.
do elevador.
And
E
here's the
coloca
tension
a
of those
tensão
relations,
dessas
in which,
relações em que,
despite the
apesar da
slavery
abolição da
abolition,
escravidão no
sets
Brasil,
that
marcam pra gente
that
que
colonial
esse
past
passado
isn't as
colonial não é
past
tão
as it
passado
seems,
assim,
where
né? O
domestic
desempregadas
workers still
domésticas
today,
ainda
and
hoje,
despite the
apesar
logic of
das
distancing,
lógicas de
are kept in the
distanciamento,
houses
são
of
mantidas
the
nas
grand
casas da
bourgeoisie
grande burguesia, né?
from those that rule
Dos que
and
mandam
misrule
e
the country
desmandam no
today.
país hoje. Né?
So
Então,
the access to labor,
o acesso
even if
ao
super
trabalho, mesmo que
precarious, is
super
still inflicted
precarizado,
by a logic
ainda é
of
infligido por uma
necropolitics.
lógica necropolítica.
Anyway, we could cite here many
Enfim,
other
poderíamos citar aqui
situations in
várias
which
outras
necropolitics
situações em que a
has
necropolítica
had
tem
that
se
effect,
feito,
and
e
it's worth
aí
to note
acho
that
que
we
vale a
live here in
pena
Brazil
demarcar que a
with
gente
a
vive hoje aqui no
government
Brasil
that is
um governo
neo-fascist, ultra-liberal,
neofascista,
and that
ultraliberal,
comes
e que
to
vem
sharpen even more
abusando
these
ainda mais
questions
essas
of
dimensões,
necropolitics
né,
in
da
the life
necropolítica
of the
na
black
vida da
population,
população negra,
and neatly affirms and
demarcadamente
pronounces
afirma e
discourses that are
profere discursos
racist,
racistas, né,
neo-fascist,
neofascistas,
and
e que
that give us
colocam pra gente um
an
desafio
important challenge. And
importante.
to start
E
finishing
para ir finalizando,
our first
essa
contribution
nossa
here,
primeira contribuição aqui, né,
and
e
to be
poder
able to
trocar
exchange
mais
some
algumas
reflections with you,
reflexões com vocês,
I bring as a slogan
eu trago
the
como
one
mote o mote
from the
do
Black Youth
movimento da
Movement
juventude
in reply
negra
to all
em
this process of
resposta a todo esse
necropolitics in the
processo de
country,
necropolítica no país,
in Brazil.
né? E
And the
aí o
slogan
slogan
Black
Vidas
Lives
Negras
Matter arrives
Importam,
here at
ele chega
Brazil
aqui no
in a
Brasil,
process
né?
of
Sim, também
solidarity
num
and
processo de
articulation
solidariedade, né? E de
from
articulação
what happened
a
with
partir do que
George Floyd
aconteceu
in the
com
United
George Floyd
States,
nos Estados Unidos,
but it takes other
mas que toma outras
proportions in the
proporções no
context of the
contexto da
pandemic here
pandemia
in
no
Brazil.
Brasil, né? Aonde
Looking at the case
olhamos
of
para o
João
caso
Pedro,
do
looking at the
João
case of
Pedro,
Miguel
olhamos
and
para o caso do
various other
Miguel e de
children
várias
that
outras
saw their
crianças
future
que tiveram seu
interrupted,
futuro
the
interrompido, né?
possibility
A
to keep
impossibilidade de
dreaming, to
permanecer
keep
sonhando,
building
de permanecer
an horizon
construindo
of future.
um horizonte de futuro,
And so we built the
e que
slogan
construímos assim um
nor
slogan
COVID,
que é nem
nor
Covid,
shootings, and
nem
neither
tiro,
hunger.
nem fome.
The black
O
people
povo
wants to live.
preto quer viver, né?
That
E
slogan
aí
made
esse
that
slogan fez
the
com
black
que a
youth here
juventude
in
negra aqui
Brazil,
no
mainly
Brasil,
in Rio de
principalmente
Janeiro,
no Rio de
went to the
Janeiro,
streets,
fosse às
even in a
ruas,
period of
mesmo num
pandemic,
período de
to
pandemia,
fight against the
para
police
lutar
violence,
contra a violência
denying
policial,
all of
né,
this
negando
process of
todo esse processo de
precariousness of life
precarização da
that was
vida que foi
imposed to the black
imposto à
population
população
today,
negra hoje,
and
e
denouncing nationally
denunciando,
and
né,
internationally
nacionalmente e
what has been going on
internacionalmente
here in
o que vem
Brazil.
acontecendo aqui no Brasil.
In the face
Em face
of the
de
of
grandes
great polemics
polêmicas,
of
né, sobre a
the
ocupação
occupying
das ruas
of the
nesse contexto de
streets in times of
pandemia, sobre
pandemic,
a
of the production of
produção de
more
mais
agglomerations,
aglomerações,
and taking into
em
account that
medida
great
em que
part
a
of the
grande parte
left
da esquerda aqui no
was
país
defending
estão, né,
the
num processo de
distancing
defesa do distanciamento, né, que tem sido
that has been
colocado
put
em xeque pelo
to the
governo
test by
federal,
the federal government,
em que pese
in which it
a
weights the possibility
possibilidade
of those people
dessas pessoas estarem se
being
expondo,
exposed
né,
themselves more to
mais
the
ao
COVID.
adoecimento por Covid,
The slums
as favelas
have
desceram
gone
e
down and
foram
went
aos
to the
asfaltos.
streets. Black
As
people
pessoas
have indeed
pretas se
exposed
colocaram de
themselves
fato em
by saying that
exposição, falando que,
even
mesmo
if this
que esse
virus is
vírus seja
dangerous,
perigoso,
it's dangerous in the
ele é
same measure
perigoso
that
à
the
mesma medida
police
em que
is
a polícia
dangerous, also
também é
dangerous, and
perigosa
goes
e
to
vai
our
à
houses
casa
to
de
kill.
todos para matar.
So there's no hierarchization of
Hierarquização do
danger.
perigo, né?
There's a
Onde ele está
danger
colocado,
doing the
podendo
social
fazer esse
dance
distanciamento social
distancing
ou
or
não
not doing.
fazendo, né? E que,
Unfortunately, it's
infelizmente,
because
é por conta da
of the
lógica que
racist
política
and
racista e
necropolitic
necroquímica
logic that we are
somos
obliged to put
obrigados a nos
ourselves
colocar
in
nas
the streets
ruas
in this
nesse
context.
contexto, né? Enfim,
There are many
acho que são
challenges
muitos desafios
and
aí e que teremos
we have some needs
algumas
to
necessidades,
reflect
né, de
from
refletir a
this
partir desse
context
contexto que
we're
aqui
in
está colocado
about the
sobre
place
o
that
lugar, sim,
structural
que o
racism
racismo
occupies
estrutural
in the dispute of
ocupa
the class
nas
struggle today
disputas
in
da
the
luta de
world,
classe hoje no mundo
and which is our
e qual
conception
é a nossa
by affirming
concepção,
the
né, afirmando a
racialization for
racialização,
the
tanto
negritude
pela
or blackness
branquitude, né,
and every
ou
other
todas as
experience
outras
that confront
experiências que
racism,
confrontam o
as well
racismo,
as the
como
whiteness.
também pela branquitude, né, ou
The
branquidade,
necessity
a
to
necessidade
racialize
de
those debates,
racializarmos esses
to be
debates
able to
para
deepen the
conseguir
analysis
aprofundar
that put
análises que
ourselves
coloquem a
at the
gente
level
ao
of the
patamar dos
present
desafios que
challenges.
estão colocados. Né?
And it's from
E é um pouco a
these
partir dessas
questions that I
questões que eu
finish my first
encerro essa minha
contribution.
primeira contribuição
And well, I'll
e,
pass it
enfim,
to
passo o bate-bola
Mamadou
pro Mabadubá
so we can continue
para
in this
permanecermos aí
debate, in
nesse
this
bate-bola,
reflection.
nessa reflexão.
Olá, olá.
Hello, hello.
Força.
Can you hear me?
Estão a ouvir-me? Olha, primeiro que
Look,
tudo,
I would
também
also like to
agradecer
thank
o
the
o
invitation and
convite e,
mostly
sobretudo, a
the
companhia
company
do
of
João
Janu
e
and
da
Sophia.
Sofia. Para mim é sempre um
And
prazer
it's always a
partilhar
pleasure
experiências
to share experiences
com camaradas
with
do outro
comrades
lado do
from the other
Atlântico,
side of the
por
Atlantic
várias
for
razões,
various
sobretudo quando nós
reasons,
estamos a discutir
especially
racismo
when we're
estrutural
discussing questions like structural racism
e privilégio branco,
and
não
white
é?
privilege. It
Seria,
would
sem
be,
dúvida,
without a
uma
doubt,
grande
a
lacuna não
huge gap
termos uma
not to
voz
have
vinda
a
do
voice from
Brasil,
Brazil,
tendo em conta a
taking
dimensão
into account the
histórica
historical
e o
dimension and the
trajeto
trajectory
histórico desse
historical
debate,
of that
o
debate
resultado
and the
temporário
contemporary
da
result
formulação
of the
sociológica
sociological
da sociedade
formulation of the
brasileira e
Brazilian
das
society
contradições
and the
sociais e
contradictions,
políticas.
social and
Portanto, eu quero
political.
felicitar-vos
So I would
por
like to
isso
congratulate
e
you
também
for
dizer que
that,
estou muito
and I
contente,
will also like to
sobretudo por
say
outra
that I'm
razão,
very happy,
que é a
especially for
nossa
another
corrente
reason, which is
decida
that our current
dar
decides
alguma
to give
centralidade a
some
este debate,
centrality to that
que não é
debate,
nenhuma novidade,
which
é
is not
uma
anything
forma de
new.
nós
It's a
resgatarmos um
way
bocado a nossa
of
tradição.
kind rescuing our
A
tradition.
gente, pouca gente se
Few
lembra disso,
people
ou toda a gente
remembers this,
sabe,
or few people
ou
know,
já se
or
esqueceu.
have forgotten
Mas a
already,
primeira
but
vez
the
no
first
século
time in the
XX que se
20th
usou o
century
adjetivo
that the
racista
adjective
foi num livro
racist
do
was
Trotsky.
used was in a book of Trotsky.
Até então
Until
não
then,
havia o
the
adjetivo
adjective
racista em
racist
nenhum
was not
escrito
present on any political
político.
writing.
Podia-se falar de discriminação,
We
podia-se
could
falar de outras
we
coisas,
could
mas
talk about discrimination, we could talk
o
about other
adjetivo
things, but the
racista
adjective
vem do
racist
livro de Trotsky,
comes from
que ele pensou
Trotsky's
a
book,
história da
which he
Revolução
did
Russa,
about the Russian question,
da questão
on
nacional.
the national
Pela
question.
primeira vez ele usa esta
For the
expressão.
first time, he
Portanto,
uses this expression. That
é a
is,
nossa
it's
obrigação
our
não
obligation
deixarmos
not to let this
que este
debate
debate
to be
seja
captured
capturado
by
por outras
other
correntes que não,
currents
não o
that don't
saibam
know how
usar
to use
como
it
instrumento de luta
as
pela
a
transformação
struggle,
radical das
as an
relações de
instrument of
forças.
struggle for a radical transformation of the
Portanto, eu fico
relation of
muito contente de
forces.
facto
So I'm
que
really
nós
happy for the
discutamos
fact
isto
that we discuss this
na nossa
in our
corrente
current,
e no âmbito
in the
de um
scope
debate teórico.
of a theoretical
A
debate.
Sofia fez
Sophia
quase
has almost done an
sobrefolhou,
overflight
mas do ponto de vista
on,
estrutural,
from a structural point of view,
queria também
that I
dizer.
would
Eu quero
also
fazer
like to say.
alguns
I would like to
apontamentos
make
daquilo
some
que ela já
notes on
disse,
what she's already said,
para reforçar
to
bocado o que
reinforce
ela
what she
disse,
said
o caráter estrutural do
on the
racismo.
structural character of
Porque é que nós
racism.
falamos de racismo
And
estrutural?
why do
Muitas
we talk
vezes
about
há
structural
debate
racism? Many
entre
times
nós,
there's a
nossa
debate
corrente, que
among
está
us in our
resolvido.
current that is not
E precisamos
settled.
resolver esse
And
debate.
we need to solve that
Porque
debate.
o
Because
racismo tem o
racism
seu caráter
has its
estrutural
structural
por
character
duas
for
razões.
two reasons:
Pela forma como
by the
nasceu
way it was born
e pela forma como
and by the
sobrevive.
way it survives.
Nasceu um
It was
processo
born in a process
de
of
apropriação e
appropriation and
acumulação
accumulation
do
of
recurso.
resources.
É assim que nasce
And
o
it's
racismo
it's this way that
moderno, digamos.
modern
Porque
racism is born, let's say.
antes disso
And
já
as we know
houve vários
it,
processos de racialização
Before that, there were already various processes of racialization. For example, the currents with which we could discuss and we don't discuss, black black Marxism. They discussed this a lot. Cedric Robinson, in his book, he talks about the process of racialization, which is previous even to what we considered as the modern area of capitalism as we know it. But there's a clear evidence that the structure of racism and its surviving as it manifests itself today is related with two historical processes that continue in construction in the present: slavery and colonialism, that in turn are related to the mechanisms of accumulation and appropriation of resources and denaturalization of people, or their dehumanization to transform them in tradable goods. Everything in a logic of capitalist accumulation, thus making of racism effectively a structural question of the political or economic system in which we live in. And to understand that is absolutely crucial so that we realize how we can look at the tools we have at our disposal now to fight it in the scope of a class struggle that has a heterodox vision of its application in the social conflicts. Because it's not believable, credible, it's not serious for us to think that we solely choose the category race as principal category in the struggle against inequalities. We're covering all of the other inequalities that happen by very other circumstances that have as well their own structure and capitalist itself. So it's good that we come to make this heterodox reading. It's what our founding fathers advised us to do and founding mothers. A heterodox lecture of Marxism that can look to a strategic horizon a bit more further away and extended, that is able to understand that the contradictions of capitalism don't manifest themselves through only one prism, which is the class struggle. Because if it was like that, we wouldn't even have had the debate that Trotsky had in the 30s. Once again, I'm returning to this with the comrades of the SWP of the United States when the black question arose, in which he clearly said in a long exchange with C.L.R. James that it was evidently important to give some autonomy to the black workers, because that showed one thing in my opinion. Trotsky It's that Trotsky had read the works of Du Bois, which claimed himself socialist in the United States, black socialist, and Du Bois had two concepts that also helped to understand what's structural racism. He had the concept of the line of color and the concept of symbolic privilege. So he said, why do white workers that are exploited by capital, that are crushed by capital, continue to have racist attitudes to their black working colleagues? Because there's an accumulation of political subjectivity that is born from this idea of blessed universalism, that people are all universally equal, independently of their historical circumstance, of their cultural circumstance, or their social circumstance. They're all equal. So, what would lead those people then to think otherwise? Because they already thought, they had completely drank that idea that yes, because they were white, independently from being below the social pyramid, they had some advantage on black workers, so they could afford to discriminate them. So that had, as a repercussion, the line of color, of which the boys spoke of. And then Trotsky, when Trotsky discusses with C.L.R. James about the necessity of having a black state or not, or autonomous black movements, it's because he had really understood the structural character of racism. And it seems to me that if we want to rescue this tradition, applying it to nowadays, we have to do what Sophia has also noted: to look at how the state, which transformed itself in the watchguard of the capitalist system, the modern state today is a watchguard of the capitalist system. It doesn't serve the interests, public ones, of the majority, and most of all, of the disinherited. It serves the interests that are agreed by the political elite with in close relation with the economical elite. So the state is formatted and formulated to guarantee there's a maintenance of the current order that sits precisely in a lifting, a kind of serology of or washing or a rhetorical and juridical serology of the property and accumulation laws. And that continues precisely to fabricate a necropolitics, a politics of death in various ways, by default or by excess, always. By default, when the state fails to meet its main obligations in guaranteeing decent life conditions to certain people or sections of the population that by its characteristics, historical, cultural ones, or by its geographical location, what is the territory that they occupy in the drawing of the country, in the social organization of the territory, or by excess in the way that the state transforms itself in a military of the system, watching in a vigilance way and oppressing those who are the army that produces the wealth. So, on that vigilance, there's a mechanism the state uses, which is the police repression, and there's the creation of internal borders between those who are part or not of the national fabric, and we enter in the bulk of our debate, where I think that as revolutionary socialists we have to discuss it with a great deal of frontality. Those are two essential questions for us. To face the global character of structural racism, which is the question of the nation state and borders. Because a revolutionary socialist has to understand that the drawing of the nation state, it matches the interests of the bourgeoisie of the places where it's settled in, and the bourgeoisie will do everything to stratify people in function of the gains that can obtain from that, creating always the conflict between what it thinks is part of a determined social geography and cultural against other sector of the society. And that articulation, that structure, it's an ideological structure. We cannot fight the structural racism if we don't conceive racism also as a political category. And being a political category, it has to have a structural dimension. It has to end with the current order as it is, right? It makes part of that mechanic of the order like it is. And it seems important to me to connect to what Sophia said earlier. The origin of the regime lays a lot in the predation in its broader sense. And the author that Sophia was citing earlier about necropolitics, he nowadays talks a lot about the democracy of the living, which is a dimension that is almost like, I would say, an advanced version of what we can consider eco-socialism, because the ecological injustice and racial injustice, they all ground themselves in a logic of predation, in a material sense and in a symbolic sense. The predation of the resources for an elite, quitting that possibility to a majority of the population, the predation of an idea of belonging, that is the hygienization that of the belonging to a certain category of people, so the categorization of people in function of their tone of skin or their cultural belonging, and all those mechanisms are related to something that is absolutely structural, which is that we don't discuss among us. Where does structural racism lie on? Which is the Enlightenment. The currents of Enlightenment are the currents of the matrix of the structural racism. Because philosophically, all the great thinkers, Diderot, Kant, Hegel, Hume, Voltaire, Victor Hugo, Kant, all of them have consolidated an idea that yes, there was a stratification of the human race, and moreover, they gave scientific endorsement to the slavery, and that thesis, that doctrinal origin of the structural racism goes through as well, unfortunately, our current, and we have to have the courage to face it and to understand that some, because we assume, and that's a correct assumption, that Marx took Hegel's systemization further, and therefore, in the sequence, the others that followed, namely Lenin and Trotsky himself, took even further the systemization, especially the question on history. So there's a sediment, a deposit of the Enlightenment that stays and contaminates our way to understand what's universalism. What is to be a person, non-white, in a world that was imagined and idealized by white people as universal. And it's needed from us to disuniversalize in an heterodox way the universalizing thinking of the anti-racist question in our currents. This is crucial so that we don't then fall in the dangers that do exist and are real, namely on the question that will occupy us more on the second half, the question of the white privilege. Evidently, the white privilege exists, but the white privilege, it has dangers if it's approached as it's being approached in a dry way in our currents and on anti-racist movements. But it has great potentialities. Moreover, it doesn't do justice to the person that coined this concept, which was a British theorist, Ruth Frankenberg. When she coined the concept of white privilege, she was not in a logic of essentialization. That is, she was mostly in a logic of understanding how the processes of racialization only occurred from the imaginary of Western societies. What does that imply after in the contemporary time? In the way that societies that with the end of apartheid, the end of segregation laws, but with the transformation of the racist ideology in a racist culture. That is the banalization of racism. Despite racism was scientifically defeated, not existing that idea of superior and inferior racist, despite those hoaxes were scientifically defeated, there's a cultural substract that remained. That's called counter-hegemony, cultural hegemony. That cultural hegemony stayed in the legislative production, cultural production, scientific production, political production, the collective imaginary. So all those spaces ossify and densify an idea that, even if it's socially reprehensible, subjectively it's something that's thinkable and in a limit can be acceptable. And it can be recoverable by any political project that can have some dream or desire of a return to the past. So when she coined this, she was basically saying, no, no, be careful. I'm not saying, when I'm talking about white privilege, that all white people are privileged. That's not it at all, because it's not, actually. Now, that every white people, by comparison with black people of the same class, are privileged, this is undeniable. If it wasn't like this, Obama was the first black president of the United States. He was the object of mockery, the boss of G8. the boss of the empire. He was the object of racist mockery in the G8 summit. And on that table of eight, he was the most powerful man in the world sitting there. But the real symbolic word power that he had didn't stop that he was object of racial prejudice. So what white privilege means, most of all, is that we have to leave the chimera of the post-racial idea that we are in a post-racial era, because it's not possible to have a post-racial era within a social structure grounded in a strong colonial heritage in the Western society where the political conduction of the destinies of the world happen, the ones that determine how the world should be ran. Now, nowadays, the nerve center of capitalism are in structurally colonialist and slaveocrat societies. The five represent, except China, in the Security Council, were world powers that were slaveocrats and colonialists. So those are the ones that leverage the world capitalism and, in its turn, structure the social relations and economical of the contemporary society. So it's not possible for us to think the question of the white privilege without thinking about this. The whiteness is something subjectively very strong that has to do with the place you're speaking from. A white person was not educated, was not formatted from its place to hate himself or herself with the lens that uses to look at non-white people. And that's what transforms its alienation, the violences, or the microviolences, the aggressions that other people, non-white, suffer, which turned that white person insensitive, or it takes that white person to devalue those violences, as the white person did not go through the process of racialization that led to a dehumanization. That person was always the one that determined, or its social structure and social cultural structure was the one that determined that certain colors or cultural heritage mean to have certain aptitudes, intellectual, psychology, and cultural. That is, if we're they can determine if we're equal or if we're inferior, if we're the same or if we're different. And that culture is one that constructs itself over time. And that's why that when we talk about, for example, the generalization on racism, many people tell us you're generalizing. Why does that happen? It's the typical expression of the white privilege, because white privilege has accustomed itself to look at the black person as a totality. A black represents every black, whatever he does. A white can do whatever he wants, he represents himself. He's an individuality. And we see, for example, when there's a fight in a beach. In Portugal, we had the steaming case in Carcavelos that it really didn't happen. From that day on, every young black people that go to the beach represent every young blacks from Portugal. But the man that killed Bruno Candé, whose t-shirt I have here a week ago, who says he insulted him various times before with racist insults before executing him in the middle of the street when he was entering jail, said he had killed many like this one, like him in the former colonies in Angola. But out of the sudden, what was being said on this? He only represents himself. It does not represent the white people. And that mechanic of when facing a political and concrete circumstance that involves a racialized subject, being black, Roma, Muslim, or any other, being his action taken as representative of the totality of the identity attributed to him, and that the contrary is not possible, is an expression of white privilege. It's that way the white privilege can run through, because the raciality isn't seen as an historical process, but as a process of social determinism. That is, there are people that because they belong to a certain culture or they have a certain tone of skin color are like that. End of story. That is almost kind of return to the biological racism camouflaged. And that expression of white privilege also materialize itself in other dimensions, which is we cannot never look at the more visible contradictions, more visible. For example, that are palpable, touchable, at plain sight. Why is it true that in a faculty in a region like Lisbon that has 5% of black population, we don't have even 1% or half percent of black students? Of all the scholar community is around 10% of the population of the metropolitan area of Lisbon. How is it possible not to have 1% of black people in faculties or also other areas? Because the economic structure and the social structure, the political structure, does not allow that people, non-white, do that path. So, to me, we need to discuss all of this, and we need to discuss three things that seem important to me. The question of whiteness, that only makes sense to be discussed by us, our current, if it has the component of class analysis and power relations. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. Because it can only have some content if it leads us to extrapolate or to overflow the economic relations that exist in our society. If they manage to translate the inequalities that we confront ourselves with as a community. And like that, it does really make sense to understand how it manifests itself, because whiteness is not an identity, because there's a difference between identity and identification. An identity is a collective construction of oneself by oneself or by another from a projection. An identification is an option that I make. There are white people that identify themselves with black culture and they have the right to do so. End of story. And that's why the debate among us should never be, in my opinion, this error we've been making, mostly some of our sectors, about the identitarian panic. Because the identitarian panic is another symptom of the white privilege. It's a symptom, the identitarian panic, of white privilege. No one ever cared that until now, until we understood that effectively, from the moment that it's possible to establish a mirror situation, that is, to look at the mirror and to realize that yes, it's from my chromatic dimension that I can have certain privileges that a black comrade beside me cannot have. No one ever cared this is annoying, and it's good that it's annoying. It means we're doing some of the path in the sense of exploding with some categories that can close us down in our pigmentation or our cultural belonging, our religious belonging, our gender dimension or sexual orientation. It means that we're being able to do this path. Now, one thing is to understand how, in the class struggle, some sectors that we dispute have given in to the thesis of the reification of certain people, because this idea has survived throughout history. We can have made a long path by ending with slavery, ending with colonialism, but our collective imaginary was very sharpened by the idea that there are people that, for what they are considered inferior. And even if you make a big effort, but once the cultural hegemony has maintained itself, we don't give the most radical step, which is look at a person like that person is and to dispute with her another way to face the world. And how can we solve this? There are two things that seem important to me for our current, which are to learn how to discuss with the currents there are in our margins. For example, the decolonial currents. Note that the decolonial current already has a decolonial international, which means there is some room for dialogue because the horizon those currents trace, the first goal is anti-capitalist, which is a common denominator minimum for now, let's say it like this, so that we can establish a dialogue with these currents. Secondly, the idea of total emancipation. And thirdly, is a very advanced idea of eco-socialism, as we projected. It's the idea that there's no possible socialism if eco-socialism is to be transformed merely into a question between human being and nature, and that the human race believes itself to be above the rest of the universe, and that it doesn't realize it's just one piece inside of the own mechanic of the universe, and that it has become a factor of not of balance, of guarantee of survival of the universe as we know it, but as a source of its its own end of a catastrophe, being one of the potential responsible of a possible next climate catastrophe. And I think this is a quite happy formulation, and it's a formulation that adds itself to our own formulation of what's eco-socialism in a radical way. So currents that fight for anti-capitalism, eco-socialism, even if formulated in a distinct manner from our own, are currents with which we must discuss, because they're the ones that put the person, in the center of the political dispute, firstly, and that's absolutely fundamental, and that puts the universe in the center of the economical relations, that is what is on the table. It's not capital that has to drive politics, it's politics that have to drive capital, and it's a difference that does justice to what those currents have been proposing, taking into account the relations of historical inequality, where they come from. They were the one that were always crushed by the systemic nature of the mechanisms of primitive accumulation of the capital and its maintenance through many shapes, through the nation state and other mechanisms. I think it would be very important for us to be able to discuss this. And there's another challenge that Sophia has also put, which is how
né,
are we going to center
olhar o nosso olhar sobre o
our
significado
look
universal.
on the meaning
Porque uma
of the
corrente
universal,
como a nossa,
of
que é
what's the
internacionalista,
universal? Because a current
tem que ter a
like ours, which
capacidade
is internationalist,
de
has to have the
representar aquilo
capacity
que é uma das nossas bandeiras, por exemplo, na área
to
LGBTQI+,
represent
né? O
what's
arco-íris.
one of our flags, for
Portanto,
example, the
as várias
LGBTQ area,
tonalidades
the rainbow.
da humanidade, né,
So
devem
the many
caber numa
tones
reflexão
of the
para a transformação
humanity
radical das relações de
should
força a nível
fit
global.
in
Ora,
a
isso não se pode
reflection to
fazer
the
a partir
radical
de uma
change of the
dimensão
relations of
unilateral,
forces
de
at the global
formulação de
level. And
pensamento,
well, this cannot be
de
made
interpretação
through
do mundo.
an
Não, não.
unilateral
Tem que
dimension
ter capacidade de
of thought
incorporar
formulation and world
outras
interpretation. No,
multivivências,
it has to have the
né, da
capacity
forma
to
como nós
incorporate
queremos
other
romper com o
worldviews
sistema
in the
tal e
way
como
that we
ele
want to
está,
break
e quiçá, quem sabe,
with the
como
system,
diria o velho
just
barbudo,
as it is,
senão será das
and
margens
perhaps maybe,
que
who
haverá o
knows,
fim do
as it
mundo,
said the
tal e
old
qual como
bearded,
nós o conhecemos.
if it wouldn't be from the margins that the end of the world will come
Acabo por aqui.
as we know it.
Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado,
I'll end here.
tanto ao Mamadou como à Sofia, pelas vossas
Thank you.
intervenções.
Thank you a lot,
E
Mamadou and
depois,
Sophia,
depois
for
destas
your
intervenções, obviamente,
interventions.
passaremos
And
ao debate.
after this,
E
we'll
convidamos toda a
obviously
gente
go
que queira
to the
fazer alguma
debate,
pergunta,
and we
tanto à
invite
Sofia como ao
everyone
Mamadou, ou fazer
that
qualquer
wants
tipo de
to ask
comentário
any question
que se
to
sinta
Sophia or
disponível para o
Mamadou or
fazer.
make any kind of
E uma vez
comment
mais, obrigado pela vossa
to feel
disponibilidade
available to do so.
para o
And once
debate e por
again,
terem
thanks for your
aceito este convite.
availability for the debate
Obrigado.
and
Obrigado,
for having
sobretudo, à
accepted
Sofia
this
também.
invitation.
Eu que agradeço.
Thank you.
Obrigado a
And
ti
thank you
por ter
mostly
um
to
motivo
Sophia as
espontâneo.
well.
Eu estou num sítio que não tem muita luz, mas